Okay, here we go. Test recording, Gaultney reunion 2022. Take one. J.R. Newman, also known as Joseph Rankin Newman, and Joseph Reese Newman, was born to Isabella Rankin and James M. Newman in Jefferson County, Tennessee on July 7th, 1824. He married Mary A. Lockhart on April 19th, 1848, and they would have 10 children over the next 13 years. However, they would lose 4 of those children at a very young age. Sarah Isabella in 1852, age about 3. Lydia Jane, age about 1. An unnamed daughter, probably born in childbirth or shortly thereafter, and an unnamed son, again, also born, probably still born or died shortly thereafter. And then the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War broke out in 1861, and J.R. enlisted in the 43rd Tennessee, serving in the Confederate Army. Unfortunately, Mary would die in 1863, and 2 neighbors, Martha A. Bradshaw and Margaret Copeland, would take the children in. Now, while on leave from the Army in 1864, J.R. and Martha Bradshaw married in February of that year. When the war ended in 1865, J.R. came back to Jefferson County and tries, like all surviving Union and Confederate veterans, to return to normal life. Now, I've heard several stories about what happens, but it comes down to there being bad feelings over the war and possibly threats against J.R. and maybe some of the other Confederate veterans. And finally, J.R. sells out, probably to his father, Colonel Jim, which is how one story takes it. Then he takes Martha, the children, and Margaret Copeland, and leaves Jefferson County, eventually coming to, and finally comes to the Bryson, Giles County, Tennessee area. Don't know the exact date, but we know that probably sometime either the date range is probably somewhere in the summer of 1865 to sometime in 1867. Not real sure about this. I haven't found any records definitively proving this one way or the other, but we do know that J.R. and Martha have a daughter, Mary, who is baptized in the Bethany Presbyterian Church in, I do not have that here, October 7th, 1867. I have that someplace, luckily. And there are conflicting stories about why they came to Bryson, by the way. One version has that there was a preacher who had been in the Jefferson County area the family knew, and another version had, and he had come to Bryson and was preaching at Bethany. Another version of the story has them on the train coming down from Knoxville, Tennessee to Decatur, Alabama, and on the train he's asking about any Presbyterian churches in the area, and somebody recommends Bethany, and so they come. There's also possible indications that when they first get here, first get to Giles County, they settle in the Wheelerton area, which is over right on the Lincoln County line, before they finally buy the property right across the road from the cemetery. Now, at the point when they move down here, the surviving children from the first marriage, Oliver Hood is the oldest child, and he's about 15. So, none of the children are old enough to be out on their own at this point. That even the oldest girl would have only been about 15, 16 years old. And by the way, Oliver Hood's date is not, he would be 15 in 1866. So he may be younger, depending on whether they come right after the Civil War. He may be older if they're a year or two if they're, closer to the birth of Mary, the half sister. So we don't really know about when they came. Actually, he would be about 16 in 1866. Pardon me. Again, not considered technically old enough to be out on his own, and the other children would be Henry Harrison 15, Nancy Elizabeth 13, Archibald Blackburn 11, Boyd Robinson 7, and Lee Converse 5. Again, these are plus or minus a year. So, they could be a year younger, they could be a year older, but they're roughly that age when they come down to Giles County. Now, again, they eventually buy part of the property across the road from the Bethany Cemetery, and this had been owned by Duncan Brown, and Duncan Brown had owned the plot where the cemetery is, and he gives the land in 1827 to the Tennessee Presbytery for the establishment of a church in the Bryson area, and in 1827, St. Paul's Presbyterian Church is established. But in 1828, the name is changed, and for you wondering about the cemetery, that comes about in 1829. And then in 1848, Major John Bass, who lives just a mile or so away, gives another plot of land for the church. The church moves, and to that plot and the cemetery is, well, since the Presbytery no longer is using that site as a church, they give it back, and the Browns and the rest of the church at this point basically create a trust fund to maintain the cemetery into perpetuity. It's still in use today, and this is 1848 to 2022, so it's 160 roughly years later. It's still in operation. In fact, we just had a burial. Our most recent burial at this point is 2 years ago. My mother, unfortunately. But anyway, now the family would marry. The children would grow up, marry, disperse. J.R. and Martha would have. I've already mentioned Mary. There would be 5 more children. Charles Edward, who would live to 23 years before he passes away. Ella Blanche, who dies at age 2, roughly. Jimmy Bradshaw Newman, who again dies at about age 2. And Emma, who will live right at 90 years, and she will. Oh yeah, Mary dies just shortly after being baptized, and so she's less than a year old. And Emma will marry Martin, John Martin from Bryson, and they'll have several kids. And then the youngest son of J.R. and Martha Newman is Melville Thomas, who's born in 1876, dies in 1967. That's my great-grandfather. And the Gaultney clan are all descended from Nancy Elizabeth, and I'm fixing to explain how, or tell how. After the Civil War, another gentleman named William Samuel Gaultney, who is from North Carolina, comes to Giles County. And he and Nancy Elizabeth meet, and they marry. And then they have 6 kids as well. 7, pardon me. There's Ira B., born in 1873. Bascom Reese, who is born in 1876. I don't have a death date on him. Bert Hood, born in 1878, who all the Gaultneys assembled here are descended from. Bessie Lou, born 1880. I don't have a death date on her, probably. Bergie May, 1882. Minnie Viola, 1887. Again, I don't have, these are all birth dates. I don't have death dates. I'm presuming that when I don't have a death date, they died very young, possibly within the same year. And finally, there is also to William Samuel and Nancy Elizabeth, who is known within the family as the Gaultney children as Nanny Gaultney. She'll have an unborn son, died either in childbirth or very shortly thereafter in 1888. And unfortunately, I think what happens is she's doesn't fully recover from the childbirth, and she dies later that year as well. And William Samuel will marry Sally McGuire, in 1890, and they would both pass away later. I don't have a year on Sally. William would die in 1906, and Nancy Elizabeth, William Samuel, Sally, and all the children who die young are all buried in the Bee Spring Cemetery. Now, the disposition of the family from this point on is Bert Hood Gaultney, Melville Newman, and Emma Newman all remain in the Bryson area, all marry locals, and have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren and so on. Ira B. Gaultney, Lee Converse Newman, Lloyd Robinson Newman, and Oliver Hood Newman, who were all J.R.'s children by Mary Lockhart Newman, would all, the latter three, that is, being J.R. and Mary's children, would all move to Texas. Archibald Blackburn Newman and Henry Harrison Newman will go to Florida. Henry Harrison, before that, though, marries Amanda Jane Stevenson, who is a granddaughter of Duncan Brown. Unfortunately, she dies young. I haven't found any record. Shortly after a few years after the marriage, I can't find any record of children. I hadn't found any record of children yet, but she's buried in Bee Spring as well. After that, we have, of course, J.R. And then I forgot Martha dying in, I forgot what, 1878. J.R. remarries in 1879. He marries Margaret Ralston, a local woman. Never marries Margaret Copeland, but she, along with J.R., Martha, Margaret, the three children who die young, and also M.T. Newman, Melville, and his wife and several of their children, including a son, Charles Keith, another son, Charles Keith, who dies young, and then Bert Gaultney Newman, George Lee Newman, my grandfather, and M.T. Jr. all grow up, have children. All three grow up, have children, remain in the family. Joe Deacon, marries and moves to Atlanta. And the sixth son, Fred, is Andrew Fred, spends grows up, marries, divorces, marries again, lives in Chattanooga area most of his life. Bert Hood, M.T. Jr., Bert Hood, or Bert Gaultney Newman, and George Lee Newman, and their wives are all married here in Bethany, along with Bert Hood Gaultney's son, Samuel Newman Gaultney and Mary Gaultney, his daughter, along with George Lee's sons, Melville Thomas and George Wynn Sr., my father, and George Lee's and MT's, and well, MT also has a son, MT the third, who dies young as well. There and so far, and they're all buried at Bryson. Mom and Dad are buried side by side. MT is buried by himself. Uncle Mel is buried by himself. Joe Mack is still alive, but his wife Nelda has passed, and she's buried here. And George Lee's fourth son, which is Robert, is buried in Foley, Alabama, where he lived at the time of his death with his third wife. And that's it. And I'm going to have to cut. I am going to have to cut or streamline